do you find that like the economics around revenue per square foot are just different because of that density you're able to get on the storage side? Or is that really where the value is coming from? Or is it in the fact that people don't have to walk as much to those long line picks?
I think there's multiple levels to it. I think you're right. The fact that I'm working vertically, we look at it through the lens of cubic footage versus square footage. So I run a significantly smaller building, almost 25% the size of everybody else. So that's one. I have less square footage involved. So because I work vertically, I can get more revenue per square footage, which is one of the historic measurements for, if you talk to most CFOs in the 3PL space, it's how they look at profitability and things in that building. So we do get more activity per square foot as a result of that. I have significantly less headcount because 100% of my picking is automated. And typically, especially in the profiles that we're in, 60 to 70% of the headcount sits right there. And most cost models has 65% of the cost tied to variable labor. So we make a big impact in those things. Now, on the flip side, I do have costs that those other guys don't have, right? I've got all this R&D. I've got brand new buildings that are only a year or two old. There's things like if I go up against somebody that owns their building and has amortized it 4 times over because it's a 100-year-old building, a family-owned business, like their building costs them nothing other than taxes at this point, right? So there are anomalies to it, but in general, yeah, I think those are probably the two biggest components of it for sure.
So you guys are obviously taking the approach of we're a robotics company, but now we're also going to do fulfillment as a bit of a case study and to learn and to really get that proof of concept that's there. Can you talk about the calculus that a legacy fulfillment center would have to go through as they're considering bringing robotics into their facility?
So there's a lot of things. I think the first and foremost, they got to truly understand their labor cost. I think one of the most technical questions I've had since I've been on the robotics side is what does it really cost you in terms of hourly? I think most people look at it through the lens of I pay X an hour and I've got 20 or 30% in benefits and taxes on the back end, and they stop there. But they don't account for overtime, downtime, unproductive labor when they hire in peak seasons. They don't think about increased labor costs at peak to get people for a short period of time and compete for that variable labor, flex labor at that time of the year. Some of the bigger companies have like flex things, like they're doing tuition reimbursements, they're doing benefits in addition, they're doing all kinds of bonus structures and whatever. And so one is they've got to truly understand their labor. They need to understand the profile of their customer. And I think they need to have a lane to stay in if you're going to really invest in a lot of this automation and stop being all things to everybody and try to figure out a category or a few categories that would make sense for this and then build a building around a profile or a customer and just chase that customer instead of you've done these tours, right? You go in there and they're doing toys on one side and they've got B2B on the other side and they've got big heavy stuff somewhere else. And then they got every category you can think of all under one roof. And you're just like, how can you be good at any of those things because you're doing so many different things. So you probably need to change your sales targets to focus on and build buildings around profiles and customer types that you want to get. And then once they get into it, they have to understand some of the things we talk about, like those islands of automation and how do I get the different pieces of my operation to talk together. And they also have to maybe think about their waiving strategy differently, or when I say waiving, how they release orders to do that. That might change in an automation profile. And then figure out there's probably some tech layer they've got to overlay a WMS, typically referred to as warehouse execution. So is that done through the robotics company, which a lot of times it is? Is that done through a third party? Like a Vargo, as an example, tends to play in that space. So you got to account for that extra layer that you might now need to add into it. You have to account for the cost of support. Are you doing that in-house? Do you have to buy a support package? And then the other thing that's nice now that didn't exist in the early days is most of the solutions have a simulator, and you should run your profiles through a simulator and see is what they're selling actually going to help us, and use your baseline of understanding your true units per hour. I find a lot of people don't understand that. And so understanding what's your throughput, if I invest in this, run the simulations with your data, and can that throughput look equal to or better than what I'm doing is another component to it. And then I think the other thing is right now, people have this false expectations of superhuman. If I get 100 units an hour out of my people, I need like 4,000 units from a machine, and we're not there yet. Like we're a long ways from there. I think at some point in time we will have superhuman capabilities, but AI especially anything that's using artificial intelligence is an iterative solution because of all the reinforced learning and machine learning, and you need reps and you need at bats and you figure out ways to do it incrementally better each time over. So those are a lot of the things that people would have to get in to think through if they're starting from scratch and figuring out how do I go from A to B in my automation and robotics journey. There's a lot of things they need to understand before they start engaging with people that are selling them solutions.
Yeah, one of the things that you alluded to that I want to click on a little bit more is, and I've heard this before, is this concept of you're either all in or you're not all in when it comes to robotics. And so I have a friend who used to work with building autonomous warehouses. And he said the way you do it is you build the robotics shell first and then you put the building over top of it. And he said it was very difficult to go in afterward and to retrofit something or to just do a little bit of it. Do you see it the same way where it's if a fulfillment center wants to get into robotics, they're probably better off starting a brand new building and moving into that? Or is it something where, yeah, you can test and learn into this piece there?
I definitely am more aligned to your friend there that I think there's a happy medium. I think it depends on type of solution. I think the best bang for your buck in the long-term outcome is starting from a greenfield environment and using solutions that get you closer to that dark storage or dark fulfillment mindset that everybody talks about. And we're not there yet. Don't get me wrong. There's still a lot that has to happen, but there's also a lot of solutions out there though that are built around retrofitting. And I think most of the AMRs are that way. There's several other, any of those things that are like some type of autonomous vehicle that don't need a guide can be built around it. Now, the things you have to worry about when you do that is rack spacing or aisle spacing. So the distance between rack A and rack B, they need a wider aisle than most people typically have. So you need to understand, can you support it and get the payback on it? They usually recommend like almost 5 feet of space between the two sides of the racking in order to allow for enough travel for two robots to go through and people to go through safely and those things. And so I've heard of horror stories where too narrow of an aisle causes the throughput to actually go down, and because they take longer routes and they go 50 miles out of their way to come back to meet the other person to avoid getting stopped by passerbyers and stuff like that. But there are a lot of solutions that are meant for retrofitting. So I think a lot of it depends on your capital, right? If you have capital, and capital's different animal now in 23 than it was in say 2020, where it felt like it was free. I don't know that people are throwing a lot of capex at things right now. And so if cost of capital is a thing that probably needs to go into consideration of ROIs and stuff like that right now, because it's very costly. But let's say that capital didn't cost you anything and it was good and I had endless cash and life was great, then I would start there. But most businesses aren't heavy on cash. Life's not great. Cost of capital is really expensive. So there are a lot of people that I think can make incremental gains in a retrofit environment. It just their solution's not going to be as productive. It won't have probably as good of an ROI and probably won't have as high of a throughput if you got to start from scratch. But there's the haves and the have-nots, and most people seem to be in the have-nots right now. And so you take incremental gains where you can get them for sure.
Yeah, that's helpful. So if you were living in 2021, you could take a few more risks than maybe you can in 2023.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was so cheap to get cash. I mean, we saw so many crazy things that happen, but now like cash is king again all of a sudden when you get into pushing double digit interest rates. And so people think about it very differently. And that's where I think some of those other platforms we talked about, like robotics as a service or 3PLs that have a transactional price versus having to shell out a ton of cash, is probably the short-term journey for people to get into an automated solution sooner than later.
Yeah.